The auctioneer's voice cut through the damp March air like a rusty saw blade, a rhythmic, hypnotic chant that had separated generations of farmers from their hard-earned cash. It was the Miller farm auction, a sad affair. Old man Miller had held on as long as he could, but a bad heart and 2 years of bad prices had finally put his land and his life's work under the hammer. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, just watching. I wasn't here to buy land. I couldn't afford it, and I wouldn't borrow to get it. That was my father's rule, and now it was mine. If you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. Most of the good equipment had already gone. A well-kept John Deere 4020, the pride of Miller's fleet, sold for a price that made me wince. A newer Ford pickup went for more than it was worth, fueled by neighborly pride and the competitive spirit that auctions always seemed to dredge up. Now, they were down to the odds and ends, the stuff pushed to the back fence row, the mechanical skeletons that time and the elements had started to reclaim. That's when I saw him. Richard Davies. Rich, as everyone called him, and for good reason. His father owned the biggest spread in the county, and Rich was busy making it bigger. He swaggered through the crowd, his brand-new cowboy boots sinking into the mud. He wore a clean seed corn cap and a jacket without a single grease stain on it. He looked like a farmer from a magazine, not one who'd ever had to bust his knuckles on a frozen bolt in the dead of January. He was laughing with a couple of other young bucks, all of them flush with the promise of the 1973 grain markets. Prices were climbing, the Russians were buying, and the talk at the co-op was all about expansion. "Look what the cat dragged in," Rich said, his voice loud enough for a dozen people to hear. He nodded his chin toward me. "Jedediah Stone. You here to pick up a spare cotter pin? Might be all you can afford, Stone." His friends chuckled. I just gave him a slow nod, my face as blank as a winter sky. Showing emotion to a man like Rich was like bleeding in a shark tank. He fed on it. I learned long ago to give him nothing. Our families had farmed side by side for 50 years. My grandfather and his had been friends, but our fathers had chosen different paths. His had borrowed, leveraged, and expanded. Mine had scrimped, saved, and solidified. The Davies farm was 10 times the size of mine, all shiny green and red paint, financed by the First National Bank of Cedar County. My farm was small, paid for, and run with machines that were older than Rich himself. My prize tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a workhorse I'd rebuilt from the crankshaft out. My chore tractor was a 1951 Farmall M my dad had bought new. They were simple, tough, and I knew every nut and bolt on them. I didn't have a cab, air conditioning, or a radio. I had the sun on my neck and the sound of a diesel engine that I understood like my own heartbeat. To Rich, this made me a relic, a failure. The auctioneer moved on. "All right, folks, last big item before we get to the household goods, pushed over by the woods. We got a Gleaner L2 combine. As is, where is. Buyer responsible for removal." A murmur went through the crowd. The L2 was a monster, a silver giant that had been the talk of the county when Miller bought it a few years back. It could eat 8 rows of corn at a pass. But now it was a ghost. It sat listing to one side, its sheet metal blackened and warped. A small but intense fire in the engine bay had cooked everything aft of the cab. The tires were flat, the glass was shattered, and a thick coat of rust was already blooming on the exposed metal. "What's the story on that, Earl?" someone shouted to the auctioneer. Earl spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Engine fire last harvest. Cooked the motor and the wiring, but good. Miller's boy said the thresher and the grain head are fine, but the engine seized solid. We're selling it for scrap value, boys. What am I bid for this fine piece of agricultural art? Let's start it at $500. Who'll give me $500? Silence. Even the bird seemed to stop chirping. $500 was a lot for a piece of scrap that would cost another $500 just to haul away. Rich Davies laughed out loud. You'd have to pay someone to take that thing, Earl. It's an anchor. I started walking toward it, my boots making sucking sounds in the mud. The crowd parted, watching me. I ignored them. I ignored Rich's smug grin. I ran my hand over the cold, fire-damaged sheet metal. I climbed the ladder, what was left of it, and peered into the engine compartment. He was right. It was a disaster. The big Alice Chalmers diesel was a boat anchor. The wiring was a melted ball of copper and plastic. The hydraulic lines were brittle and cracked. But I looked past the fire damage. I looked at the bones. The frame was straight and heavy. I slid underneath, the damp earth soaking through my jeans. The variable speed drive, the belts, the augers. They were dirty, but they were intact. The fire had been hot but fast. It had destroyed the power plant, but the heart of the machine, the part that actually separated the grain, was untouched. It was like finding a beautiful house with a furnace that had exploded. The mess was terrible, but the foundation was solid. I walked back to the crowd. Rich was watching me, a look of pure amusement on his face. Thinking of getting into the scrap business, Stone? Might be more profitable than trying to farm with those antiques of yours. I looked straight at the auctioneer. $100, I said, my voice calm and clear. A few people gasped. Rich barked a laugh. He's serious. The fool is serious. Earl, the auctioneer, looked stunned for a second. Then his professional instincts kicked in. I got $100 from Mr. Stone. Who'll give $150? $150 anywhere. It's worth more than that in scrap iron, boys. He looked around, but everyone was just staring at me. They weren't seeing a combine. They were seeing a fool, a young man throwing away the last of his money on a heap of junk. Sold! Earl cried, banging his fist on his notepad. For $100 to Jedediah Stone. Good luck to you, son. I think you're going to need it. The walk to the auctioneer's trailer to pay my $100 was the longest walk of my life. I could feel Rich Davies's eyes boring into my back. I could hear the whispers ripple through the crowd. Lost his mind. Poor Jed. His father must be spinning in his grave. I handed over 5 worn $20 bills, got my receipt, and walked back to my truck without looking at anyone. As I pulled out of the muddy field, I saw Rich standing with his arms crossed, shaking his head with a pitying smile. He thought he was watching a man bury himself. He had no idea he was watching a man lay a cornerstone. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what was wrong with that old gleaner, and the sweat and blood it took to bring it back from the dead, I've got to ask you folks listening to this. Have you ever bought something everyone else called junk? A rusty tool, a broken-down engine, a forgotten piece of equipment, only to turn it into gold with your own 2 hands? Let me know down in the comments what your greatest scrapyard find was. I'd surely like to read about it. All right, back to the story. Getting that combine home was a bigger job than buying it. It took me 2 days with a borrowed heavy-duty winch and my 40-20 whining in low gear to drag it out of the fence row and onto the road. I had to hire a flatbed truck from the next town over, which cost me twice what I paid for the combine itself. The whole time, a steady stream of neighbors drove by, slowing down to stare at the blackened hulk being winched onto the trailer. Each one of them had the same look on their face, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. We finally got it back to my place and unloaded it behind the barn, where it sat like a wounded beast, an eyesore against the neat, whitewashed lines of my buildings. For the rest of the spring and through the summer, it was the first thing I saw when I stepped out of the house in the morning, and the last thing I saw when I came in from the fields at night. It was a constant, silent reminder of the gamble I'd taken and the ridicule I'd earned. The planting season of 1973 was a good one. The rain came when it was needed, and the sun shone bright. My corn grew tall and straight. All the while, Rich Davies was making moves. He bought the 80 acres that bordered my north field, the one Old Man Miller had lost. He tore out the fence row between the properties, creating a massive, unbroken sea of corn. Then he took delivery of a brand new international harvester, 1066, complete with the deluxe cab. You could hear the radio playing from a quarter-mile away. He was farming in a rolling glass box, cool and comfortable, while I was out on my open station 4020, eating dust and swatting flies. The talk at the diner was all about Rich, how smart he was, how he was getting ahead of the curve. "You got to spend money to make money," they'd say, nodding wisely over their coffee cups. "That's the new way of farming." They'd see me walk in, covered in grease and dirt, and the conversation would quiet down. They'd ask me how my project was coming along, a little smirk playing on their lips. "Slow and steady," I'd say, and leave it at that. I finished my fieldwork in late summer and turned my full attention to the Gleaner. The first order of business was to perform an autopsy on the engine. I spent a week just cleaning the soot and grime off, pressure washing every surface until I could see the bare metal. The fire had been centered around the fuel injector pump, a leaking diesel line most likely. The heat had been so intense it had melted the aluminum valve cover and fused the wiring into a single, useless lump. Using a 3/4-inch breaker bar with a long pipe on the end for leverage, I tried to turn the crankshaft. It wouldn't budge. Seized solid, just as the auctioneer had said. I pulled the cylinder head, a massive chunk of cast iron that took my engine hoist to lift. What I saw inside was ugly. 2 of the pistons had melted at the crown, welding themselves to the cylinder walls. The heat had been so extreme, it had warped the block itself. The engine was scrap. No question about it. For a moment, standing there in my quiet barn, with the smell of burnt oil thick in the air, a wave of doubt washed over me. The whispers of the town, the mocking smile of Rich Davies, they echoed in my head. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had bought a $100 monument to my own foolishness. I sat down on an overturned bucket, my hands hanging limp between my knees, and just stared at the dead heart of the machine. But then my father's voice came to me, as clear as if he were standing right there. "Son," he'd always said, "a machine is just a collection of problems. You solve one problem at a time, and pretty soon you ain't got no more problems. You got a machine that works." I took a deep breath, stood up, and went back to work. The engine was a loss, but it was just one component. I started looking for a replacement. A new engine from Alice Chalmers would have cost more than my entire farm was worth. A used one from another L2 was impossible to find. So I started thinking outside the box. I spent my evenings poring over old truck and industrial equipment manuals I'd ordered from a place in Kansas City. I was looking for a diesel engine with the right horsepower, the right torque curve, and a bell housing that I could adapt to fit the Gleaner's transmission. After a month of searching, I found it. In a salvage yard 2 counties over, sitting in the rusted-out frame of a wrecked white Freightliner, was a Cummins NTC 350. It was a big, inline 6 engine, known for being tough as nails. The truck had been rolled, crushing the cab, but the engine bay was mostly untouched. I bought it for $400, cash, The next month was a blur of grinding, welding, and fabricating. The Cummins was a different size and shape than the old Alice engine. I had to cut out the old engine mounts and weld in new ones I'd made from quarter-inch steel plate. I spent a week just measuring, remeasuring, and tack welding them into place, making sure the alignment with the transmission was perfect, down to the 1,000th of an inch. A mistake here would shred a clutch or a drive shaft in minutes. The hardest part was the wiring. The fire had destroyed the entire harness. I couldn't buy a new one. They didn't exist. So I had to build one from scratch. I bought 100 feet of multicolored wire, a set of crimpers, and a wiring diagram I'd found in a service manual. Night after night, I sat at my workbench under a single bare bulb, my fingers raw and clumsy, tracing circuits, cutting wires to length, crimping on connectors, and wrapping the bundles in friction tape. Gauges, sending units, starter solenoid, alternator, each one a separate problem to be solved. It was slow, tedious work that strained my eyes and my patience. All through that autumn, while Rich Davies was driving his new 1066 over his newly acquired land, I was in my barn, a greasy, solitary figure, bringing a dead machine back to life, one wire, one bolt at a time. The first snow fell in November, and still I worked. The cold in that old barn was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that settled in my bones. I worked with numb fingers, my breath pluming in the frigid air, the only heat coming from a small pot-bellied stove in the corner. By early December, it was ready. The Cummins engine sat snug on its new mounts. The new wiring harness was routed and connected. I'd replaced every single hydraulic hose, every belt, and every filter. I'd even found a new seat at a tractor salvage yard and patched the broken windows with plexiglass. It wasn't pretty. The engine was a different color than the rest of the machine, and my welds were functional, not beautiful. But it was solid. The moment of truth came on a cold, clear Saturday afternoon. I filled the radiator with antifreeze, put fresh diesel in the tank, and connected 2 heavy-duty batteries. I climbed into the cab, the patched-up seat cold beneath me. I took a deep breath, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The big Cummins cranked slowly at first, groaning against the cold, thick oil. Then it coughed, belching a cloud of black smoke from the straight pipe I'd welded for an exhaust. It coughed again, and then, with a deafening roar, it caught. The whole machine shuddered to life. The sound was glorious, a deep, throaty rumble that was 100 times better than the whine of the old Alice engine. It was the sound of 1,000 hours of work, of ridicule endured, of a gamble paying off. I let it run for a minute, the vibrations humming up through the floorboards, a triumphant grin spreading across my face. I had done it. The scrap heap was alive. The boom years of the mid-1970s were a heady time to be a farmer. Grain prices, which had been flat for years, suddenly shot for the moon. It started with the Russian wheat deal in '72 and just kept climbing. The government was encouraging us to plant fence-row to fence-row, and the banks were more than happy to lend us the money to do it. The official word from the Secretary of Agriculture himself was, "Get big or get out." It was a time of boundless optimism, a gold rush in the corn and soybean fields of the American heartland. Rich Davies was the poster boy for this new era. With the price of corn over $3 a bushel, the loan he'd taken out for the Miller place, and the new 1066 suddenly looked like a stroke of genius. The bank loved him. They saw his aggressive expansion not as a risk, but as a sign of a sharp, forward-thinking operator. Before the snow melted in the spring of '74, Richard bought another 200 acres. To work it, he bought another, even bigger tractor, a brand new 4-wheel-drive Steiger Panther, a green monster that could pull a 12-bottom plow. He also traded his combine for the newest, biggest John Deere model, the 7700, complete with a grain monitor and hydrostatic drive. His operation was the talk of the county. His yard looked like a machinery dealer's lot. Everything was new, shiny, and big. When he drove that Steiger down the road, people would pull over just to watch it go by. He was the king of Cedar County, and he knew it. He started spending his winters in Florida, leaving the farm work to a hired hand. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an agribusinessman. And me? I was still Jedediah Stone, the guy with the old tractors and the junkyard combine. The harvest of '73 had been a good one for me. My resurrected gleaner had performed flawlessly. Its size was overkill for my 160 acres. I was done with my corn in 3 days. But that was part of the plan. I put an ad in the local paper. Custom harvesting. Reasonable rates. My first calls were from older farmers, guys with small acreages who couldn't justify owning their own combine. Their old 2-row corn pickers were slow, and hiring the big custom crews was too expensive. I'd show up with my ugly but powerful gleaner, and they'd look at it with skepticism. But when they saw it chew through 8 rows of corn without even breathing hard, their skepticism turned to respect. I was fast, I was careful, and my rates were fair. I worked from sunup to sundown that fall, harvesting my own crops and then thousands of acres for my neighbors. When the dust settled, I'd had my most profitable year ever. But what I did with the money was what truly set me apart from Rich Davies and the others who were chasing the boom. I didn't buy more land. I didn't buy a new tractor. I took every spare dollar, and I did 2 things. First, I walked into the bank and paid off the last remaining $10,000 on the farm's mortgage. The farm my grandfather had homesteaded was now, for the first time in 30 years, completely and totally free of debt. The feeling of walking out of that bank, holding the deed stamped paid in full, was 100 times better than sitting in the cab of a new tractor. Second, I took the rest of the money, a substantial sum from the custom work, and I put it in a simple savings account. Cash. Safe, liquid, and earning a modest interest. I was building a fortress, not an empire. The community didn't see it that way. They saw Rich Davies with his new land and new equipment, and they saw me with the same old 40-120, the same old Farmall M, and a combine that looked like it had been put together from a scrap pile. They saw Rich as a success, and me as a man paralyzed by fear. A man with no ambition. You know, Jed, one of the old-timers told me at the feed store one day. A man's got to take a chance to get ahead. Land prices are only going one way. Up. You're missing the boat, son. Even Rich offered me his brand of condescending advice. He stopped his shiny new pickup next to my field one afternoon while I was greasing the gleaner. "Stone," he said, leaning out the window. "I don't get you. You've got the best combine in the county, and you're using it to make pocket change, harvesting for a bunch of old coots. You should be leveraging that asset. Buy some more ground. The bank will give you anything you want right now." "I'm happy with what I've got, Rich," I said, not looking up from the grease zerk. He shook his head and laughed. "You're just like your old man. Terrified of debt. You can't build anything real with cash alone. It's too slow. You'll die poor, but by God, you'll be debt-free." He sped off in a cloud of dust, leaving me in the quiet of the afternoon. The years rolled on. The mid-'70s continued to be good. Prices stayed high, and the rain kept falling. Rich's empire grew. He bought more land every year, his debt climbing into the stratosphere. He built a new house, a sprawling ranch-style home with a swimming pool. He was living the dream. I kept my head down. I farmed my land, maintained my old equipment, and spent my autumns doing custom harvesting. My cash reserve grew steadily. I replaced things only when they were truly worn out, and I always paid cash. I bought a newer, used grain truck. I built a new machine shed, paying the lumber yard and the concrete company on the day the work was done. I was invisible, a quiet, debt-free island in a sea of leveraged prosperity. But I was starting to see cracks in the foundation of that prosperity. The price of fuel was going up. Fertilizer costs were doubling. The interest rates on the radio news were always ticking higher. Inflation was a word on everyone's lips. The loan officer at the bank, who used to greet farmers with a smile and an open checkbook, was starting to look a little nervous. One evening in the late summer of 1979, I was listening to the radio in my barn when a report came on. The Federal Reserve, in a drastic move to combat runaway inflation, had raised the prime interest rate to a shocking new high. I didn't understand all the financial talk, but I understood the tone in the reporter's voice. It was grim. I shut off the radio and looked out at the open barn door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Across the road, I could see the lights of Rich Davies's massive new house click on. His empire was shining bright, a beacon of modern, aggressive farming. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was all built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was about to turn. The first sign of trouble wasn't a banker's letter or a dip in the market. It was the sky. The summer of 1980, the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun baked the fields. The corn, which had stood so proud and green in June, began to curl its leaves inward, a desperate, thirsty prayer. The ground cracked open in patterns like old pottery. Ponds shrank, their muddy edges receding to reveal skeletons of fish and old tires. For me, it was a worry. A bad year would eat into my savings, but it wouldn't break me. For Rich Davies, it was a catastrophe. His vast acreage, his enormous operating loans for seed and fertilizer were all predicated on a bumper crop. Every single stalk of his corn had a lien on it from the First National Bank. He was farming on a knife's edge, and the weather was about to send him tumbling. I saw the change in him at the co-op. The swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic, hunted look. His clothes were still clean, but his face was drawn and pale under his tan. He was always on the payphone in the corner, his voice a low, urgent murmur. I'd hear snippets as I walked by. Extension. Another 30 days. Just need one good rain. The rain never came. The second sign was the sound of machinery breaking. One sweltering afternoon in late August, I was replacing a bearing on my cotton planter when I heard a high-pitched mechanical scream from across the road, followed by an abrupt silence. It was Rich's Steiger Panther. I saw him climb out of the cab, throw his cap on the ground, and kick the massive dual tire. He was trying to do his fall tillage early, ripping into the baked earth to prepare for next year. A desperate act of faith that there would be a next year. I walked over. "Trouble?" I asked. He barely looked at me. "Rear differential went out," he snapped, his voice raw with frustration. "Just grenaded itself. Can you believe it? A 2-year-old tractor." I looked at the giant green machine. It was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a mystery. Its planetary final drives and complex hydraulic systems were beyond the scope of a farm shop repair. "Gonna call the dealer?" "Already did," he said, rubbing his temples. "They can't get a mechanic out here till Tuesday. Said the parts alone will be over $5,000. $5,000! For a goddamn bearing and a few gears." He kicked the tire again, a hollow, unsatisfying thud. And I've got a payment on this thing due next week that's twice that. I just nodded. There was nothing to say. My old 4020 had a simple sliding gear transmission I could rebuild on my shop floor with a set of wrenches and a manual. His rolling monument to progress was dead in the water, waiting for a specialist and a check he couldn't write. The harvest that year was a grim affair. The yields were less than half of what we'd hoped. The ears of corn were small and stunted, the kernels loose on the cob. My old gleaner handled it without a problem. I finished my own fields in a couple of days and started on my custom work. The mood was different this year. There was no cheerful banter over the CB radio, no friendly waves from the road. There was just a quiet, desperate rush to get what little crop there was into the bin before the first snow. Rich's brand new John Deere 7700 went down twice. The first time, a hydraulic pump failed, costing him 2 precious days and a $3,000 repair bill. The second time was worse. A small, unassuming black box, the electronic controller for the grain loss monitor, fried itself. The dealer in Cedar Rapids didn't have one in stock. It had to be ordered from the factory in Moline. It would take a week. I saw him sitting in his pickup at the end of his field, just staring at the silent, useless yellow and green machine. His 800 acres of corn stood waiting, drying down too fast in the wind, shelling out on the ground with every gust. He was losing money by the minute. That evening, I finished up a job for a neighbor and drove my gleaner down the road. I didn't stop at my place. I pulled into his lane. He came out of the house, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. "What do you want, Stone?" "Heard you were having trouble," I said, idling the big Cummins down. "Looks like you could use a hand." He stared at me, then at my combine, its silver paint dusty, but its engine rumbling with a steady, reliable rhythm. I could see the war in his eyes, his pride fighting against his desperation. For a full minute, he said nothing. "I can't pay you," he finally mumbled, his eyes fixed on the gravel at his feet. "The bank's got everything." "We'll worry about that later," I said. "Right now, that corn needs to come out of the field. You tell me where to start." He looked up, and for the first time since we were kids, I saw something in his face other than arrogance or pity. It was a sliver of gratitude, raw and painful. He just nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and pointed toward the backfield. For the next 5 days, from before the sun was up until long after it set, my old, fire-damaged junkyard combine ate its way through Rich Davies's corn, its single headlight cutting a lone path through the dusty darkness. I was harvesting the bitter fruits of a broken dream. The winter of 1981 was a quiet, cold purgatory. The price of corn, which should have risen due to the drought, collapsed instead. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union had shut off our biggest customer. It was the perfect storm, a terrible crop, rock-bottom prices, and interest rates that were climbing into the 20s. The get big or get out philosophy had become a death trap. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper like obituaries. First it was the younger guys, the ones who had borrowed the most aggressively. Then it was established, multi-generational farms, families who had weathered the Great Depression but couldn't survive the Great Reset of the 1980s. The auction bills were tacked to the bulletin board at the co-op, a wall of shame and sorrow. These weren't retirement sales. They were funerals. Rich held on longer than most. He sold off some of his newer equipment over the winter, trying to raise cash to appease the bank. The Steiger went first, fetching less than half what he'd paid for it. Then a few wagons, the big chisel plough. It was like a man cutting off his own limbs to feed a wolf, a hopeless gesture that only delayed the inevitable. The end came on a cold day in March. I saw the notice in the paper. Public auction, it read. By order of the First National Bank of Cedar County, the real and personal property of Davies Farms. It listed it all: the 800 acres of prime bottomland, the new house with the swimming pool, the John Deere 7700 combine, the 1066 tractor, the whole shining, debt-fueled empire. The day of the auction was grey and damp, just like the Miller sale all those years ago. But the mood was entirely different. There was no competitive energy, no neighbourly chatter. A grim silence hung over the crowd. We were all there to watch a man be publicly dismantled, to see a family's century of work erased in a single afternoon. We were vultures at a wake, and we hated ourselves for it. Rich was there, standing beside his wife near the porch of the house they were about to lose. He looked like a stranger. His face was gaunt, his shoulders slumped inside a worn work coat. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He looked 10 years older. He was watching the banker, a man named Peterson who had once been his friend, laughing and shaking hands with a group of men in suits I didn't recognize. Corporate buyers, the insurance companies and investment groups that were circling the heartland, picking up land for pennies on the dollar. The auctioneer started with the equipment, the magnificent John Deere 7700, with less than 500 hours on it, sold for a third of its original price to one of the suits. The 1066 went for a song. Piece by piece, Rich's dream was broken up and hauled away by strangers. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, a statue of a man, watching it all burn. I survived because I had no debts. The high interest rates that were a death sentence to Rich were an inconvenience to me. The low grain prices hurt, but my custom work and my cash reserves were a buffer that saw me through. My old, simple machines kept running. When a hydraulic line on my 4020 burst that spring, I drove to town, paid $12 for a new one, and had it fixed in an hour. I didn't have to call a dealer or wait for a part. I was the master of my own small, sturdy ship in a sea of sinking yachts. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the land. They sold it off in parcels, the 200 acres he'd bought in '74. The 80 acres from the Miller farm. Each time the hammer fell, it was like a blow to the man standing on the porch. The corporate buyers got most of it, their cold, professional bidding silencing any local attempts to keep the land in the community. Then came the last parcel. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out. "This is the original Davies homestead. 160 acres, with the house, the barn and the outbuildings. A fine piece of ground, a place with history." Rich's wife finally broke, burying her face in his shoulder. He put his arm around her, his blank stare finally focusing on the auctioneer, on the crowd, on the impending loss of his home, his history, his name. The bidding started low. The men in suits were patient. They let a couple of local farmers bid it up a little. Then they stepped in, their bids coming in cool, even $5,000 increments. The local farmers dropped out one by one, shaking their heads. The price climbed to a point that was a bargain for the investors, but an impossible fortune for any of us. "Sold then, to the gentleman from—" the auctioneer started to say. "Wait," a voice cut through the silence. It was my voice. I hadn't planned it. The words just came out. Every head in the crowd turned to look at me. The banker, Peterson, looked annoyed. Rich Davies looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I have a bid," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I named a number $1,000 higher than the corporate bid. The man in the suit smiled a condescending little smile and immediately topped my bid by another $5,000. He was trying to crush me, to show me this was a game I couldn't afford to play. And this is where the story should have ended for me. He was right. I couldn't get a loan to match him. The banks weren't lending to farmers, but I didn't need a loan. I looked straight at the banker, Mr. Peterson. As an officer of the court conducting this sale, I said, my voice carrying in the still air, you are required to accept a cash bid, are you not? Peterson's eyes narrowed. Of course, but you must be able to demonstrate proof of funds. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a passbook from the Cedar County Savings and Loan. I walked up and handed it to him. The crowd murmured, craning their necks to see. Peterson opened it. His jaw went slack. He looked from the book, to me, and back to the book. All those years of custom harvesting, of frugal living, of banking every spare dollar while everyone else was borrowing, were represented by the single number at the bottom of the last page. His funds are good, Peterson announced, his voice suddenly stripped of its arrogance. The man in the suit looked at me now with a different expression. He saw I wasn't some hick playing games. I was a serious threat. We went back and forth, the bids climbing higher. The crowd was silent, watching the battle between the local farmer and the faceless corporation. Finally, the price reached a number that made my stomach clench. It was nearly everything I had. It was the gamble of a lifetime. The man in the suit conferred with his colleagues. He shook his head, gave a curt nod to the auctioneer, and stepped back. He had a budget, a calculated return on investment. I didn't. I was buying back a piece of our community. "Sold!" the auctioneer shouted, his voice booming. "For $175,000 to Jedediah Stone." A smattering of applause broke out from the local farmers. It wasn't for me, not really. It was for the small victory against the tide that was washing us all away. I walked to the trailer to sign the papers, my hand shaking slightly as I wrote the check that would drain my savings account. As I walked back to my truck, my mind reeling from what I had just done, Rich Davies intercepted me. He stood before me, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked at the ground, at my boots, anywhere but at my face. "Why?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "After everything, all the things I said, why would you do that?" I looked at him, at the man who had mocked me, who had represented everything I stood against, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, profound sorrow for all that had been lost. Because my granddad and your granddad built that fence between our farms together, I said quietly. They were neighbors. That ought to mean something. I paused, then added, "The house is empty now. You and your family can stay. No rent. Just keep an eye on the place for me until you get back on your feet." He finally looked up at me, and his face crumpled. The proud, arrogant Rich Davies was gone, replaced by a broken man, overwhelmed by an act of grace he never expected and felt he didn't deserve. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face, and walked back to his wife. In the years that followed, the farm crisis slowly receded. Prices stabilized, the rains returned, and the land began to heal. But the landscape of our community was forever changed. Many of the old family names were gone from the mailboxes, replaced by corporate logos. But the Davies name remained. Rich took my offer. He stayed in his home and worked the homestead for me on a crop share basis. The first few years were hard. His pride was a constant battle. But slowly, the bitterness was replaced by a quiet diligence. He was a good farmer, a smart farmer, when he wasn't blinded by ambition. We never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between us. We were survivors. My own life continued on its quiet, steady course. I never expanded. My 160 acres, plus the Davies homestead, was enough. The old 4020 eventually got a new coat of paint and an engine overhaul, but it remained my main tractor. And the Gleaner, my $100 scrap heap, became a local legend. Every autumn, its deep Cummins roar was a familiar sound across the county, a symbol of a different kind of success. It was the machine that had built a fortress instead of an empire, the machine that had weathered the storm. I see the old-timers at the diner now, the ones who told me I was missing the boat. They look at me with a new understanding. "Your father was a smart man, Jed," they'll say, shaking their heads. "He saw it coming." "He just believed in paying your own way," I'll reply. A few years ago, my boy Thomas turned 16. He's got the bug. He loves the land, the smell of diesel smoke, the satisfaction of a straight furrow. He spends more time in the machine shed than he does in the house. One Saturday, I found him staring at the Gleaner, a wrench in his hand. "Dad," he asked, "why did you never buy a new combine, like the ones the big outfits run now, with GPS and computers and everything?" I walked over and laid my hand on the big silver machine's faded sheet metal. It was cool to the touch. I pointed to the Cummins engine I had shoehorned into its frame so many years ago. "Because this one never sent me a bill," I said. "It doesn't have a payment book tucked in the glove box. Everything it earned, it let us keep." I looked at my son, at the future of this farm standing right in front of me. It taught me the most important lesson there is, that real wealth isn't about how much you can borrow. It's about how much you can fix with your own 2 hands. I picked up another wrench from the toolbox. "Now, let's check the tension on that main thresher belt," I said, handing it to him. "She's got a lot of harvests left in her yet." He grinned, the same grin I'm sure was on my face when my father first taught me the difference between a socket and a box end. As we bent over the heart of the old machine, the sound of our wrenches echoed in the quiet barn, a steady, patient, and enduring rhythm. The sound of a legacy.